Welcome to another Peace Psychology webinar. My name is Sandal-Önal. Today, my voice is not in its best. I have kind of a cold that has not gone away, but I'm still able to talk. So, in case my voice is not coming through well enough, that's because I have a funny cold. I'm the president of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence, which in short is a Society for Peace Psychology. Today, we are very happy to have two scholars with us to examine peace research in Turkey. And as you will hear, they will specifically focus on the so-called Kurdish issue. Our first speaker is Mete Sefa Uysal, who is an assistant professor in social and political psychology at the University of Exeter. He is broadly interested in radical social change, including social movements, climate activism, resistance, and grassroots peace building. He co-edited The Political Psychology of Kurds in Turkey, Critical Perspectives on Identity, Narratives, and Resistance and Social Psychology of Leadership and Crowds. He is currently co-editor-in-chief of the Global Environmental Psychology Journal. Mete is also recovering from a cold, but we are glad that he's still in good shape. Elif Sandal-Önal is a postdoctoral researcher in peace and conflict studies at Bielefeld University's Institute for Interdisciplinary Research on Conflict and Violence. Her current research focuses on how uncertainty interacts with political emotions and perceptions of normality, shaping democratic beliefs, political attitudes, collective identities, and collective future imaginaries among majority and minority populations. She co-edited the book The Political Psychology of Kurds in Turkey, Critical Perspectives on Identity. She also serves as an associate editor for papers on social representations. The title of their talk is Rethinking Peace Research in Turkey, Kurdish Identity, Researcher, Positionalities, and Collective Future Imagination. Before we start, I have two important reminders. First one is that there will be time for questions at the very end, but the questions will not be taken from the chat box as you might be familiar with or as you might be used to. Please leave your questions in the Q&A box. I will read the questions for the speakers at the end, and I may group them depending on the themes. And finally, this session is being recorded. It will be available on our website, peacepsychology.org, later on, and also on YouTube. That said, I now invite Mete to start.
Thank you, Seda, and thank you for all who participate. It's lovely to see too many familiar names here. Let me share my screen first so I can go on. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, let's get going then. So I want to first start with some kind of positionality statement because it would be quite bizarre not to give a positionality statement or not mention positionality, my own positionality within the context of this webinar. That we will talk a lot about the importance of researcher positionalities in the peace psychology. So I'm a Turkish researcher. So I've born and grown up in Turkey. I am ethnically Turkish, so I'm not Kurdish. And I grown up in South West Turkey. So until my university years, I could say I wasn't influenced by conflict, violence, or state oppression in that sense. And in my university years, I engaged with my friends' struggle, Kurdish friends' struggle, and I engaged with the political movements that intersect with the Kurdish political movements. So that's how I started to learn about this issue. And since then, I'm doing research on Kurdish identity and Kurdish movements in Turkey. So I can, define myself as an in-between researcher in that sense when it comes to this context. And I know that some of you are very familiar to this context, but some of you might not that much. So I will give a generic contextual information about who are the Kurds and what's going on in Turkey. And then I will continue with my main argument. So the Kurds are often known as the largest nation on the planet without a state, at around like 40 million people. And they are indigenous to Kurdistan, which is a geographic region spanning southeastern Turkey, northwestern Iran, northern Iraq, and northeastern Syria. Global Kurdish population is largely concentrated in this area, but significant communities in Kurdish diaspora exist in Europe, especially in Germany, France, Sweden, Netherlands, UK. And although Kurds are spread across countries, around half of the Kurdish population lives in the southeastern Turkey. And this webinar exclusively focused on Kurdish and peace studies conducted on and about Kurdish living in Turkey. This means that there are some arguments that are generalizable to the Kurds living in the West Asia in Kurdistan, but there are more specific to the Kurds living in Turkey, and I assume like most of the arguments will be specific to the Kurds living in Turkey. And as you may acknowledge that different nation states and different geographies bring different realities for Kurdish people, and what is the current reality of Kurdish people in Turkey. So there is an ongoing peace process, which Elif will talk a lot about on this ongoing peace process. But despite this ongoing peace process, the Kurdish people who are living in Turkey are still not allowed to get primary education in their mother tongue, and several Kurdish politicians are still in jail alongside the Kurdish activists and journalists. This webinar is structured in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to walk you through the findings from our systematic reviews, meta-analysis of social psychological research on Kurdish identity, intergroup contact, conflict, and peace in Turkey. That studies that were mostly conducted during Turkey's first peace process that happened between 2013 and 2015. We will also critically question why there is not much research before and after this peace process, and how the research conducted in this process, during the peace process, is influenced by macro political climate and state narratives. And in the second part, Elif will present what happened after the first peace process and what's going on right now in the second peace process, with some preliminary findings from our pilot study. To understand the peace research in Turkey and the issues and debates emerge in this literature, we first need to understand the context and contested points of this context. Well, the first question is how do we frame or name this issue? So if you go to newspapers or articles, you can find a lot of different framings: Kurdish question, Kurdish issue, Kurdish conflict, Turkish Kurdish conflict, state operation against Kurds, Turkish colonial practices in Kurdistan. So there are different ways, and we acknowledge that all of them come with different political packages, political positions. And I don't have a strong opinion on how we should name. I have strong opinions how we shouldn't name, but I don't have a strong opinion how we should name. So I will often use interchangeably some of these terms. But I may use, for instance, Turkish-Kurdish conflict more often, because psychological literature overwhelmingly use this framing, not because I endorse that more. And the second big debate is from what historical time should we start talking about to understand this issue. You will see in the results in a minute that some researchers take it from the Ottoman Empire, some from 1920s, as I did, and some from 1980s, where armed conflict emerged between the PKK, the armed wings of the Kurdish movement, and the states, Turkish states. And again, all these choices come with the political positioning, and they have specific meanings and consequences for the knowledge we produce. So I will start with the 1920s, because the Turkish Republic was proclaimed in 1923. With it came with the search for new civic and national identity, because this new search built on the collapse of multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire. So I'm not arguing that the Ottoman Empire was, everyone was equal in the Ottoman Empire, but um, you know uh, contrasting with the modern nation states, ethnic identity or ethnicities uh, wasn't that much influential in civic belonging in the Ottoman Empire. And then, there was a search in 1920s, beginning of 1920s, what will be the new identity, civic identity that that made this new republic meaningful for its participants. And then they come up with the idea of Turkishness. Turkishness was already there, but they basically built it as a national civic identity. But here there is a critical question, the main question that affects all the debates in the literature to this date. So whether this Turkishness or Turkish national identity was a genuinely inclusive civic identity, or was it an enforced homogeneity? Was it an assimilative ethno-national identity? The Republic's search for new civic identity was built on the fallacy that a modern state, modern nation state, must be ethnically monolithic. This creates a psychosocial contract where Turkishness became the only prototype of for an acceptable citizen. So Turkish national identity was presented as a common civic identity, common in-group identity, but in practice it was hegemonic ethnic category under which all other identities were expected to assimilate. Well, assimilate or exclude, and who's going to be assimilate and who's going to be excluded, this decision was made on the basis of religious identity. So that's another contextual things that you need to know. Because in this new republic, only non-Muslim ethnic minorities have been formally recognized as a minority because they don't need to be included this Turkishness. But on the other hand, the Kurds, although they are the largest minority group, have never been formally recognized as a minority by the state. They were, a group who needs to be Turkified, who needs to be modernized, and so on. And the early decades of Republic were marked by systematic assimilation policies. In the 1930s, publishing in Kurdish was banned. Kurdish geographical names were changed to Turkish, and the government was authorized to deport and resettle Kurdish families in Western Turkey. More than 1 million Kurds were forcibly relocated between 1925 and 1938. And of course, there were several uprisings during that period, uprisings for autonomy, uprisings for political representation, and these uprisings often were violently repressed. But the more relevant for us was the discursive change or new discursive understanding emerged during these periods. During this period, Kurdishness was started to articulate as an equivalent of backwardness, a mirror image to the Western, modern, civilized Turkish national identity. The one thing that you need to know, the political figures that established New Republic was really committed to change the rhetoric and change the vision of the image of Turkishness after the Ottoman Empire, because they don't want to be part of the Eastern anymore. They don't want to be Orient anymore. They want to be part of the Western, modern, civilized world. So you can already see the colonial language here. And this discourse was so pervasive that it's even shaped the social science and psychology knowledge produced at that time. We don't have enough time to discuss how and why this image was created and sustained in psychology. But our colleagues, our wonderful colleagues, Aydın and Ercan, I think Ercan could be here in one of the attendees, wrote this wonderful chapter for our book. And basically in this chapter, they analyzed the psychological text in Turkey across the 20th century to reveal the ruptures and continuities of colonial dichotomies via representation of Turks as dominant, progressive, and modern, and others, including Kurds, as backward, outdated masses. This backwardness narrative wasn't just a state propaganda, it became a scientific discourse. Early Turkish psychology either ignored Kurds or treated them as research object needing modernization. And we cannot assume this is a problem of old days. It still shaped today's understanding of psychology of intergroup relation in Turkey or peace psychology in Turkey. We must ask today, are we researching Kurdish identity or are we just researching its proximity to Turkishness through this mirror image we still continue to produce? And when it comes to the 18th and 90s, state violence against Kurds peaked with the military coup. This period saw official ban of the Kurdish language in both public and private spaces, systematic use of torture, and enforced disappearances. The armed conflict between the military and the Kurdish movement intensified dramatically following the PKK's insurgency beginning in 1984. And the state framed this process through the securitization and terrorism narrative, which has deeply influenced how researchers has been able to approach this topic. This is the context in which any academic work on Kurdishness, on Kurdish identity has had to operate. And as we will see, this context has fundamentally shaped what kind of research gets done and how they are conducted. This securitization of or this terrorism narrative that began or firmly established in 1980s became the primary and even sometimes the only lens for viewing and analyzing Kurds and Kurdish identity in Turkey. This securitization of research matters because it creates basically two pathways for the academic voice or academic understanding of the Kurdish issue: the climate of silence or epistemic violence. If the only sanctioned way to talk about these issues is through security, then research on rights, research on resistance become a risky political act. And the more important that this period cemented the nation state's interest as the national boundaries of the academic studies. And I'm not just talking about the Kurdish issue, but any kind of right-based, social movement-based, collective issue basically sidelined during this process. And psychology chose to isolate itself from the socio-political landscape to stay safe, which is why we see so few studies from this era, and still that understanding continue to affect our understanding or knowledge production. And then came the relative de-escalation. Turkey's EU candidacy created conditions for a peace process, so the armed conflict was temporarily silent. But this often seen as a top-down democratization or top-down peace process that paid little attention to actual political claims of Kurds. Why? Because it didn't start from the change in the mindset, but it started with some strategical decision. And why it is critical? Because it meant academic freedom was still conditional. So for psychology, this was a gold rush period to study contact or forgiveness. But because the window was so brief and unstable and based on or relying on state narrative, research often failed to challenge structural inequalities. So this research treated peace as psychological state between equals rather than process of addressing 90 years of state oppression. And the peace process ended in 2015. What followed was a deepened and hardened state oppression. So what did we do? We basically published 3 papers, one systematic review on studies on Kurdishness, Kurdish identity and conflict, and 2 meta-analytical review papers, one on identity, peace and conflict, and one on intergroup contact in Turkey. We used the same or similar data pool, around like over 60 studies, 60 paper. And our review focused on 3 databases, Web of Science, Scopus, and APA site info. So all the included articles were written in Turkish or English. We searched for Kurdish articles, but either because of our limitation to reach that articles, or the limitation of the literature, we couldn't find a Kurdish written article that fit our inclusion criteria, and we focus only exclusively the studies conducted in Turkey with the Kurdish and or Turkish samples that focus on Kurdish identity, conflict, peace, contact, and intergroup relations. So let's start with the broad patterns. That's some of the broad patterns we found. First, the studies focus on 3 main themes. So identity, conflict and reconciliation, and contact. So all of the studies, almost all of the studies we included, focus one of these topics or some combination of these 3 topics. And around half of the studies included both Turkish and Kurdish samples. But there is a catch, because in many of these 2 sample studies, Kurdish participants were a smaller subset of larger Turkish samples. With the single sample studies, about 35% of the studies were Kurdish only, and 15% were Turkish sample only. And the 74% of these studies were quantitative. Among the quantitative studies, more than 80% used student samples, and over 60% collected data only from the students at the universities in Western Turkey. That is Turkish majority, ethnically Turkish majority regions. This means that the Kurdish voice in the literature comes predominantly from the very specific subset the Kurdish students studying in Western, and we will come back to this, why that matters beyond the generalizability concerns. The one thing that we especially interested in was how these studies conceptualize Kurds as a population or as a group. And we found striking variation and often lack of contextualization. 9 studies didn't describe or discuss who Kurds are at all, although they focusing on either implicitly or explicitly focusing on peace and Kurdish issue in Turkey. 18 studies discuss Kurds as ethnic minority, 16 described as ethnic group. Only 2 of them recognize Kurds as existing outside of Turkey, such as the multi-state ethnic group. 12 studies referred to Kurds as minority group, and then there were some exceptions. 1 study described Kurds as minority group indigenous to Anatolia. 1 referred as internally colonized people. 1 described as diaspora across the Middle East. Why these things are important? Because we see an interesting pattern. We see that how researchers conceptualize Kurds shape everything that follows. Their research question, their measurements, their interpretation, how they measure Turkish identity, how they interpret, what kind of narrative they adopt when they're arguing the Kurdish issue, or even how they name it. And similarly, how did studies frame the Kurdish issue itself? So 23 papers describe it as a conflict between PKK and Turkish state or Turkish military, which began in 1980s. So only 9 studies traced to the roots to the formation of republic in 1920s. 5 went back to the Ottoman Empire. 7 discussed about the assimilationist policies I mentioned at the beginning. 2 used the language of coloniality. 1 framed it as a struggle or rights rather than a problem. And as we discuss in all these papers, the dominant framing, a conflict starting in the 18th century on PKK, implicitly adopt the state's security and terrorism narrative. It decontextualized the Kurdish issue from over a century of state oppression and assimilation. Adopting this starting point validates the state's framing on security problem rather than justice problem. This matters because it limits solution. Because if these studies are searching a solution for peace, and if they think the problem is violence, whether it's come from PKK or state, then the solution can be only de-escalation. When there is no conflict, there is a peace. And we know from the peace psychology it's not accurate. If the problem is national identity definition and the content of this national identity, then the solution can be participatory grassroots peace building, where we dialogue about the civic identity, who are the Kurds, who are the Turks, and what's the Turkish citizenship, what is the meaning of Turkish citizenship. So if we turn to the psychological findings from the meta-analysis from our quantitative data, first we found a moderate negative relationship between in-group identity and out-group attitudes. And we conduct a lot of moderation analysis, by the way, across all the meta-analysis. So this finding, the moderate negative relationship between in-group identity and out-group attitude was stable across both groups, Turks and Kurds, and across students and community samples, so across the different methodological choice. So overall, higher ethnic identification was associated with more negative attitudes toward the other group. But the pictures become more complex when we look at the discrimination. We found a moderate to strong negative relationship between Turkish identification and recognition of discrimination against Kurds. So identifying strongly with the Turkish identity requires or come with not seeing the state violence to probably protect one's group moral image. In contrast, there was a moderate to strong positive relationship between Kurdish identity and perceived discrimination of Kurds. So this asymmetry reflects a power imbalance that we see sometimes in the literature. For majority groups or for dominant groups, stronger identity means less willingness to see the minorities suffering. For the minority, stronger identity means greater awareness of or greater receptiveness of the inequalities and structural violence. Most strikingly, we found a moderate to strong negative relationship between Turkish identity and support for minority rights. But we couldn't find any significant relationship between Kurdish identity and support for Kurdish or minority rights. So this challenge, again, common assumption we often see in the peace psychology literature in social and political psychology, group processes related to collective engagement for rights should not be exclusively understood through the lens of in-group ethnic identification for minoritized group, because being Kurdish alone isn't enough to lead the right advocacy, support minority rights. Why? Because the group process for the oppressed groups are way more complex, involving fear of reprisal, politicization, intersectional identities that ethnic identification alone cannot capture. When we turn to the contact, we found moderate to strong positive relationship between in-group contact and positive out-group attitudes. This was the strongest finding across all the analysis, but contact's effect on other outcomes were much less straightforward. The relationship between contact and perceived discrimination was not significant, and the relationship between contact and support for minority rights was only significant for Turks, not for Kurds. This is what the literature often calls irony of harmony. So contact may improve attitudes while simultaneously reducing minority support or not affecting minority support for structural change. So intergroup contact that does not engage with structural inequalities may have sedative effect on minorities' collective action intentions. We also found that higher identification with the ethnic group was associated with less frequent or lower quality contact, but this effect was quite small and only significant for the university samples. How much time I have left? Around, I assume 5 more, maybe, to hit the 30.
Yeah, maximum 5.
Okay, that's great. Okay, this brings us to critical question: what don't we know, and how can we do better? First, we need to move beyond the established relationship in the literature. our meta-analysis showed that many relationships that hold in Western context are not replicable in the Turkish-Kurdish context. For instance, Kurdish ethnic identity is not consistently associated with support for Kurdish rights. This challenged the assumption that stronger minority identity automatically translate into stronger right advocacy. We know that there are additional factors at play, like politicization, intersectional identity, specific historical context that shape how identity translates into action. So intergroup relations in this context are way more complex and different than those in other contexts. So it can be harmful to presume some symmetrical association across different groups using just minority versus majority lenses. And also, what we should ask, why do we need to move away from this established literature? Because this established literature in the peace psychology mostly coming from the models for prejudice. And the models for prejudice were developed in context, in countries that were at least relative acknowledgement about past racism, whether performative or not. I'm not discussing that one, but at least there is some kind of acknowledgement that there was a racism in this country, there was a, I don't know, anti-immigrant attitudes in this country. So there were efforts to facing with that, past. But in Turkey, there's an active rejection of colonial practices and this past. So we need more context-specific, indigenous psychological frameworks that can understand these categorically different context of prejudice and discrimination. And the second major issue is how studies operationalize their variables. Many studies rely on norms and values set by nation states when defining and measuring concepts like ethnic identity, national identity, conflict, terrorism, and violence. They sometimes accommodate hegemonic nation-state narratives into the research agenda, treating society and nation-state as equivalent. The conceptualization and measurement of national ethnic identity in these studies are often rooted in the perspective of the majority group, Turkishness, ignoring the identity expression and identity dynamics of Kurds, or sometimes assume that there is one single Kurdish identity, there is one single identity expression among Kurds. And researchers in Turkey have several ways to ask about Turkish identity, for instance. They can ask about how much do you identify as Turkish, how much do you identify as a citizen of Turkey, and one can be ethnic category, one can be a civic category. So these matters, and these matters because of the methodological nationalism. Once again, I didn't name it until this point, but it is central to our critique. Methodological nationalism often refers to the situation where the nation state is treated as a natural or necessary representation of modern state, and it often happens when national discourse, agendas, and dominant historical narratives are taken for granted. And this concept is rarely discussed in psychology, but it's very pervasive in peace research, especially the Turkish-Kurdish conflict research. It shaped everything from how researchers frame their research question to how they collect data. Because psychologists think they are being very objective by measuring individual attitudes. This is insidious because if those individuals live where national discourse are taken for granted, their individual attitudes are already shaped by state narratives. It doesn't matter how you measure it. And we must make the nation state as an object of analysis rather than just a background of our analysis. I'm aware of time. I will wrap up. Let me highlight a few more concrete problems we identified. First, ambiguities in operational definitions are going beyond methodological nationalism. For instance, what is meant by contact is often not fully explained. It's sometimes measured solely based on frequency of Turkish-Kurdish friends, and the nature or quality of that contact is rarely explored. Second, the use of student samples need much more careful consideration beyond the usual concerns about generalizability. In this context, universities are often Turkish majority spaces. Even when they aren't, they are state apparatuses with increasing securitization. Beyond the Kurdish issue, the academic freedom is under threat in Turkey, but especially for Kurdish students, in these spaces, they are still beholden to Turkifying themselves to fit in. Third, most studies with or without student samples were conducted in Western Turkey with measurement devices in Turkish, none collected data in Kurdish, and very few conducted research in Kurdistan itself. And I know it's not just like a personal choice. I know there are lots of structural incentive-based or financial issues that shape this decision, but it's something that we need to talk about. Most studies don't report when their data is collected. In a context where political situation can shift dramatically from one week to other, from peace process to violent conflict, this is a massive omission. Almost none of the studies include positionality or reflexivity statement. The researcher's identity, whether they are Turkish, Kurdish, Westerner, insider, outsider, or in-betweener, fundamentally shape the research processes, but this is rarely acknowledged. We also exclude studies on the Kurdish diaspora in Europe and beyond, so we know very little about how intergroup dynamics between Turks and Kurds play out in diaspora context. This is important to know. And most critically, we need to conduct research with psychology researchers themselves. We need to ask to them about their experiences researching the conflict and peace in Turkey and Kurdishness in Turkey. What challenges did they face? How their identity create obstacle or I don't know, limitation, what prevent them from doing research in this context, and how did they decide what to measure, how to measure, or why they didn't measure in certain ways, because I still believe most of them are not individual decisions, but structural or embedded contextual issues, so we have to know more about them. So I stop here and Elif will continue.
Mete, thank you very much. Teşekkürler. Elif, it's your turn now. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I think the screen is visible, right? Mete, I can only
Yes,
see
it
you.
is.
Okay, perfect. Now I am turning our lens into the second peace process. As Mete perfectly explained, the whole overarching context of our study, we try to understand how this Kurdishness is processed, especially in psychology. But right now we want to see how this peace process is actually going, and how this second peace process, which is definitely characterized by uncertainty, is influencing Kurdish people's identities, emotions, and imaginations of a collective future. And then we started our project with certain questions about with certain questions about these how Kurds are actually thinking about the peace itself, and how do they view the peace process. So most of you already know the end of the 2015 peace process. It signaled a shift from political resolution to state-driven autocratization. And the process heavily criminalized Kurdish political representation and heavily criminalized the civil society. There was a very clear view that we can see how democratization has been eroded. There was the emergence of a security-first approach, which allowed the ruling regime to dismantle the old democratic checks and balances. Of course, you can also question if they were already available in the Turkish nation, but the last pieces of the democratic checks and balances have been destroyed, unfortunately. In October 2024, the second peace process has been launched, and it gained visibility, ironically, following a speech by the nationalist leader, Devlet Bahçeli, at a parliamentary group meeting in the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. And it initiated through some contacts between the Turkish state, the pro-Kurdish DEM party, and imprisoned PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. And following Öcalan's 25 call for disarmament, the PKK, the armed organization of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, announced its dissolution and began withdrawing its fighters. It's shifting the process from an armed conflict toward a political negotiations over democratization or something like that. However, we know that the process itself had been framed and interpreted differently by state actors and by the Kurdish or democratic stakeholders. Official discourse said this is a process of Turkey without terror, and the alternative framings were peace and democratic society. And the parliamentary commission itself, which is processing the peace process, is titled National Solidarity, Fraternity, and Democracy, which signals some kind of an emphasis on the shared history and the constructed common identity between Turks and Kurds. What we are doing, we are turning our focus onto the lay perception of the peace process. Now, we don't want to consider this peace process as something that is coming from the macro structure, from an up-down manner. So both past and current processes are interpreted through legal and institutional lenses. They all focused on the macro level political dynamics. And for this process, the public opinion polls measured some attitudes towards it. Do you support it? Do you not support it? But there is a critical gap remains in research examining what is the content and the construction of the meanings attributed to this process. So as Mete already defined, the Kurdish studies, the studies, social psychological studies in Turkey, which focused on Kurdish identity, really missed the meaning side of the issue. So they never try to explain how the meanings attributed to the very process itself, to the conflict itself, or to the peace itself is constructed. We just try now to examine this. And we plan to reveal these collectively constructed meanings of peace, but also democracy, of course, framed together with identities, the Kurdish identities, the emotions, and the future imaginations among lay actors of the process. Lay actors, not only the actors who are actively taking part in the peace process, but also the lay people, while trying to understand the role of uncertainty, because we think the uncertainty is definitely characterizing the process. So up to now, there are some studies showing us what lay people are thinking about the peace process, the ongoing peace process. We have very few studies which have a focus on the peace process itself. There are two recent studies from the region, from Samer, the Field Research Center, coming from the very beginning of 2026. And they say in the region, in the Kurdish region of the Turkey, there's a considerable support to the process, of course, but it is super fragile. The hope is low, ambiguity is high, and distrust is super clear. And the expectations for some concrete and structural steps are available. So rhetoric alone is not sufficient anymore. And of course, the people do not object to peace, but there's a strong concern for legitimizing it. And of course, justice, identity recognition, representation, and democratization. So the claims of the Kurdish people in Turkey for a very long time, starting from its very beginning, are still going on. Another research from the other side of the medal. So it is mapping the nationalism in Turkey, and they also have some questions regarding the peace process. And from that side, we see an overwhelming opposition to the key reconciliation measures. Most of the majority Turks are rejecting the amnesty for PKK members, and most of them opposing Abdullah Öcalan's release, or they are opposing removing Turkishness from the constitution. And you already know what Turkishness means for the Kurdish conflict from Mete. And the majority believe that Kurds are already treated as equal citizens, indicating limited public recognition of structural inequality. So why we say uncertainty is a defining process, defining characteristic of the process. We know that here uncertainty has been inside the process from the very beginning, because although the actors are quite visible on media, on TV, their steps towards a reconciliative result was very ambiguous, very vague. So here we can say that uncertainty is quite clear, not only in the macro or the structural or the institutional manner, but also in the collective and individual levels. And when we say that uncertainty is there, we always know that it elicits some paradoxical navigation models. So some people make, for example, look for some deliberative and dialogue-based manners to navigate their uncertainties, while the others may close themselves. But we know that the uncertainty intensifies the meaning-making attempts through identity, through emotions, or through mental simulations of what will happen next. So we see that the emotions are central in this uncertain process, and the uncertainty is not individual, it is shared. And these dynamics will show us how this peace process is representative in a collective level. So we just constructed a conceptual framework trying to understand how Kurdish peace process, the current peace process, has been meaningfully constructed by the lay people. We first try to understand how Kurdish peace process itself is expressing the uncertainty, and that uncertainty is not only characterized in the structural level, as I said, it is also subjectively and collectively shared uncertainty. We know that this uncertainty is pushing people to induce some future-oriented mental simulations, and they try to make some interpretive works to understand what is actually going on. So there will be the reconstruction of the identities in the lay people during this peace process. There will be certain emotional orientations, and there will be certain thoughts about the future. What will be the future of the Kurdish society, Kurdish communities? What will be the future of the country as a whole? And at the end, we thought that the lay representations of peace process will be understood through these lenses, and we will try to understand how people are legitimizing the process itself, whether their beliefs in democracy is still there, and whether they trust or distrust to the actors in the process, and how their collective imagination of coexistence, for example, is happening. So this project, Repeace project, we are investigating these, and we are planning to employ some semi-structured interviews across multiple sites in Turkey and also in diaspora this time. This time we are also turning our lens into Europe, and in Germany and in the United Kingdom. We will try to make some field study to understand the lay representations of this peace process. The interviews include the questions of general knowledge or thoughts about the current peace process, the emotions, the belief in democracy, trust in actors, identities, and the imagined future for Kurdish communities. So the field study has started. We already submitted our proposal to many funding bodies, but we already started the field. And the first interviews have just started, 4 in Bingöl and 2 in Germany. And there is a preliminary insight. I mean, we cannot say that we already have 6 participants. We cannot say that, yes, these are our results, but the first insights from the field are quite interesting, we thought. We just elicited certain themes from our long interviews with people, with Kurdish people, especially young people from diaspora, and relatively young people from Turkey. We saw that they are considering peace as conditional. They have a very deep distrust towards actors, of course. A high lack of knowledge, which we call the epistemic uncertainty, is available. Peace is desired, but it's considered unrealistic. There is a very clear emotional ambivalence. We cannot say, for example, we thought that the emotions would be quite clear, especially considering the very historical disarmament of the of PKK and Abdullah Öcalan's call to dissolute the PKK. But the emotions are definitely ambivalent. And the influence of the past process, Mete just mentioned, the past peace process is super clear, and peace also is considered as a relief. Now, I will show you some exemplary quotes from our interviews that you can see how these were expressed. For example, this peace as conditional theme, you see that as long as these grievances persist, peace cannot be achieved. For peace to come, these grievances must be eliminated. For example, this participant made a lot of influence on the disregarded disregarded rights of the Kurds, which has been claimed for a very long time, but unfortunately rejected by the state. A deep trust toward the actors is quite clear, and it's interesting, especially from the Turkish participant, we saw that we don't trust either side, not the Kurdish side, not the Turkish side. So there is a deep distrust towards the political leaders, political actors, we can see. Of course, there's a high epistemic uncertainty. They really do not know what is actually happening in this peace process. It feels like there are still things that are not being disclosed, things happening behind the closed door. So there is really a lack of knowledge. So they, of course, desire peace. They say, I want peace to happen, but I'm not sure it will actually be achieved. So there is, again, an ambivalence here. And the emotional ambivalence are, as I said, quite clear. They do not express one emotion. Sometimes they say hope, sometimes they say fear, but still the mixed emotions, I think the most clear expression of emotions here. And what happened after that process creates pessimism for this one. So the previous peace process, which concluded with a heightened political violence by the state, is definitely a very bad example for this one. But finally, at the end of the day, peace is a relief. So the end of the war makes me feel relieved. At the end of the day, they really want to feel that the lack of violence, lack of conflict, lack of armed conflict would end. And this is some kind of a relaxing thought for them. So we saw that the future is definitely shadowed by uncertainty, but there are some traces of hope. And I think the most important thing is here regarding future is that the future is perceived as something elite-driven. And with the epistemic uncertainty, they don't know what will happen next. This leads a weak sense of agency among lay people, lay Kurdish young people. And there is no explicit imagining of intergroup futures yet. So no one is talking about coexistence. No one is talking about separation. So nothing is articulated actually. And we believe that expanding our sample across different cities, different regions, towards diaspora will allow us for a more differentiating understanding of these patterns, of course, but we will see how this will happen. So these were only some insights. I hope that these give some kind of an understanding of what we are actually doing, and we are open, of course, to your suggestions regarding our latest project. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Elif. Teşekkürler. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I think we have several. So let me start with the first one, which is shorter than the others. The question is, how were the Kurds treated in the Ottoman Empire? Were they identified as a people during the empire days?
Can I start, Elif?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not an expert on the Ottoman history, but we know, I mean, it's not a stable history. First, we have to say that. Well, we know that they live around 4 centuries in the Ottoman Empire, and we know that at least the first 3 centuries they have some kind of autonomy and self-rule. Of course, in the exchange of some kind of loyalty for the military loyalty, let's say. So if there is a war, then the Kurds has to attend that military engagements, but they can, maintain their autonomy in the region. But especially towards the end of 19th century, is it correct? Yes, 19th century, Ottoman start to adopt more centralized approach, centralized administration. So these autonomous regions become less autonomous towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. So we know that the problems start or the oppression has, increased during those days.
Elif?
I think I do not have many things to add to Mete's points, but I would like to say, for example, this is something that we also did not consider in while asking questions to people, because we really actually do not know how people are identify themselves with the Ottoman Empire, or do they see themselves as some kind of a continuum of the Ottoman I don't know how to say it in English, but teba or something like that. So
Mhm.
we really do not know this. The discourse of the Ottoman Empire had been brought by Erdogan's AKP for the last 2 decades. So there have been a very strong rhetoric trying to link the Turkish identity to the Ottoman times. But I think this definitely requires more research whether the Kurdish people really consider themselves as part of Ottoman Empire.
Thank you. Another question, this is a little longer. Uh, when we look at the way the question or the issue is framed, we can actually see who is taking what kind of position. For instance, calling it a PKK state conflict creates the impression of two equal actors, as you mentioned, Mete, and erases the power asymmetry. Calling it ethnic tension problematizes the response to oppression rather than the oppression itself. And framing it as a conflict that began in the 80s put decades of assimilationist policies in parentheses. So is this a methodological issue or problem, a political choice, or perhaps both? What do you think the solution might be here? What are the alternatives from your position out?
Um, Again, I take the words, Elif, with your permission first. Um, Yeah, I mean it's both. It's a methodological problem because it's lack of the acknowledgement of the position. It's a political choice because of the obvious reasons. And I think it's not, adopting this political position. From my political perspective, it's problematic, yes, but from my researcher perspective alone, it's not a problem. The problem is still coming from the lack of acknowledgement or lack of recognition of the effect of such positionalities. I mean, because we have to give space for the readers, right? We can't decide everything. The reader will decide how they engage with our readings, our interpretation, and so on. And when you remove that kind of positionality, that kind of realities, that kind of identities from the, let's say, articles, then you start to talk about some findings as if they are generalizable, as if you don't have any impact on it, as if all the the measurements were super neutral. So we are talking about the facts rather than some findings, some contested findings. So therefore, my not a solution. It's a very obvious thing, but it's just the acknowledgement. And I'm not sure what might be other alternatives from that. I mean, of course, I have a very strong position what we need to call it. I think it should at least start from the national identity construction, because this is a national identity crisis. Of course, it's the right crisis, but this right crisis coming from the national identity crisis. Without questioning the civic/national identity, we cannot come up with some kind of solution. That would be my position, I guess.
Elif?
Uh, I totally agree with the Mete, but I think I have to say that this is, yes, not only a methodological problem, not only a contextual problem, but a both problem. Because you always start your research with questions, and you always start your research with something. I mean, as psychologist, I consider myself as half psychologist, but as psychologists, we always aim to operationalize our dynamics, and addressing is actually a part of this operationalization, right? You have to know what you are actually talking about. So for the Kurdish identity, for the Kurdish issue as a whole, when you consider a whole context as something, it is so political. So I have to be quite objective and stick on the current definitions. Then that means you have to stick yourself with the whatever the formal regime's discourse is. And this is definitely a problem which we can define in the limits of the methodological nationalism. So you are defining and operationalizing your variables based on the limits that the state is allowing you, and you cannot go beyond that. There might be alternatives. These alternatives can only be considered when we consider the context as something that is historical, political, social, and economic. Otherwise, we cannot do that. This question came from Demet, and together with Demet, we are doing studies about socialization, collective memory, etc. So the very memory of the Kurdish issue is even harshly constructed by the state, right? The collective memory of the Kurdish issue is constructed by the state. So at least acknowledging this and moving your research along this acknowledgement would definitely free you from these boundaries that the state is trying to hold.
Thank you, Elif. We have a couple more questions, and given the fact that we only have about 10 minutes, I think it would be a good idea for me to shorten the questions a little and for your responses to be kind of short as well. So one question has to do with the current process. Do you think the relatively surprising onset of the current process, previous shifts of the government positions on the issue, regional instability, and the recent crackdown on the main opposition party in Turkey contribute to people's lack of hope and trust in the peace process and its promise for peace and democratization?
Yes, yes, definitely yes. I mean, I don't know what to say about it more, but it is a definite yes. One of the things that we realized during that field study when we are talking to people, for example, I was with a participant who have been socialized in Germany, who cannot speak Turkish, only speak Kurdish and German. So we made our interview in English, and I just realized that that lack of hope is not only coming from that distrust or the previous peace processes, but they have some kind of a view towards the past, the whole history of the conflict itself, and they say that, okay, this has never been okay for the Kurds. This will never be okay again. So it is like a very holistic lack of hope, or the problem of, I don't know, the problem of optimism, and you can see how it is really inherited in Kurdish people or young people's views about the issue. And I think that was one of the reasons why we could not catch anything from their interviews regarding future, because the future is really, really super shady for them right now. So I think the only answer to that question is a yes, a big yes.
Thank you.
Can I add just one small thing? I think
Please.
growing up with this, the political realities make people really politically aware, and not just politically aware, but also the Kurdish people are aware of the interconnectedness of the struggle and the oppression, and therefore they already have like a holistic understanding that there is no democracy just for Kurdish people. There is no freedom just for Kurdish people. So if there will be like a democracy one day, it will be democracy for all. It will be like a rights for all. So I think therefore they take this kind of increased oppression towards the CHP, the main opposition party. They take it quite seriously and personally regarding their own struggles.
Thank you. There's another question that has to do with a very long-standing issue. So the question reads like this. In light of the Turkish government's denial of the Armenian genocide and the so-called Armenian question, how hopeful are you of this so-called peace process, especially now that Erdogan, the president, is claiming to create an empire and creating free speech? Free speech. That's all.
It's a very hard and personal question, but I would say I'm not hopeful, obviously, but I am hopeful to be hopeful, because if there is a peace process, it's definitely better than a conflict. it doesn't matter where it's come from. I'm not settled with it. I want more. But if there's a peace process, then it's a peace process. There's even if for a small window, for a small chance, we have a chance to discuss the rights, discuss the dialogue, civil rights, and so on. It is something. It's let's see how it goes. I'm not hopeful how it's gonna end up, but I feel lucky that there is at least one peace process.
Elif?
I think for me, I definitely do not see any opportunities for peace under the rule of Erdogan. So I'm more pessimistic in that occasion, but my optimistic side is coming from the possible alliances. So the harder the political violence is, the political oppression is, there will be maybe higher chances of the opponents of the opposition to come together and form an alliance. Mete would give us more insights about it since he is a collective action researcher. So if the alliance for democracy in Turkey would be possible, then we can talk about peace because we know that without justice, without democratization, the peace will not make any meanings. I think the attempts in the governance of Erdogan would be quite vague and would, at the end of the day, will not contribute to the democratization process of the country. When the attempts is feeding the democratization process of the country, then I think more positive steps will be taken and the uncertainty will a bit alleviated.
Thank you. There's another question that has to do with the role of religion and secularism, or the tradition of the Republican tradition of secularism. So let me shorten it so that it's going to be a little easier. What is the role of religion and secularism, and particularly people, some of them visionaries, who are claiming peaceful existence, particularly on the basis of faith? What role do they play in the political life of Turkey? And in general, what's the potential for religious reconciliation or the positive influence of religion on reconciliation?
Maybe I can say something about the importance of secularization or why there is a backlash against religious figure or religious understanding of the peace. Because I think it's coming from, again, this Turkishness, idea of Turkishness as a modern European identity image. Because secularization is part of that, the colonial set. We are modern, we are European, we are secular, and everything that is not one of those is not one of us, and they are backward and they are outdated and so on. Therefore, until the Erdogan, maybe still it's embedded in the system, but until the Erdogan, there was like a huge secular backlash against especially the Kurdish political figures as well, the Kurdish religious political figures, including Said Uysal and so on, in the Dersim massacres. And also, we know from some of the studies, I think, I don't know if any of them here, Uysal, Canan, Yasin, they conduct researches on religious identification and how it affects reconciliation. Religious identification, Muslim identification, of course, can help the support for reconciliation. But from that studies, we know that they are mostly not affecting or negatively affect the right-based reconciliation. These are mostly like a unity-based, fraternity-based understanding of reconciliation. And especially when we think about how Erdogan basically made religion weapon for himself, we can't expect that religious identity in its current position in the daily life discourse in Turkey will be a solution, because again, the Kurdish political rights and claim will be sidelined, and we will be focusing on unity, similarity, and so on, and it never help to the reconciliation in this context.
Okay. Elif?
I think the way how religion is right now constructed in Turkey is quite similar to how Turkishness has been constructed for years. So it is exclusionary. So from an exclusionary construction coming from the state, it is really almost impossible to reach out a reconciliatory framework. So religiosity right now is articulated together with the Turkishness, which is an exclusionary framework. And in this exclusionary framework, it is not easy to reach out the democratization and the justice framework that a reconciliation requires. So I do not have that much hope on that. But of course, IR researchers, the international relations researchers, are doing a lot about it. Maybe they have some ideas, but I do not. Yeah.
Thank you. We have about five more questions, and yet we do not have any time left at this point. So I think a couple of the questions can be perhaps posed to you directly via email because they may be people who already know you. But I do apologize for not having the time for those valuable questions. And finally, I should thank Elif and Mete for doing this for us. And it's been very informative. And I had my own questions, but I wasn't able to ask them, but I'll ask you privately. So to finish, I would like to invite everyone attending this particular webinar to follow our other webinars. And our previous webinars are available, most of them are available on our website, peacepsychology.org. And our perhaps regular wish is if you're interested in peace, if you are interested in peace psychology in particular, please join us, please join our society, and you will be in good company. So thank you very much. And we do hope, I think collectively, I can speak on behalf of the speakers, that there will be long lasting peace for Kurds and all people who live on the lands that they all consider their home.